"You're not family anymore," my son screamed, so I froze the family trust and sent him a letter from my lawyer. Then he showed up at court crying. The wedding invitation was heavy in my hands. Cream-colored cardstock, gold lettering, the kind that costs more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. But it wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to the Thompson Family Trust because that's all I was to him now, not Mom. Not even Margaret, just a signature on his monthly allowance checks. I had found it in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning, mixed in with the utility bills and grocery store flyers. My son David's wedding invitation, to a ceremony I wasn't invited to attend. The bride's name was Sophia Aldridge Chen. I'd never heard of her before, but then again, David hadn't called me in 8 months. Not since the night he screamed at me over dinner, his face red with wine and fury, telling me I was embarrassing and that his new friends didn't need to know about his trailer trash background. That was the night he said the words that changed everything. "You're not family anymore, you're just the woman who signs the checks." But let me tell you how we got there, because the David who said those words wasn't the David I raised. Somewhere along the way, I lost my son to a world that taught him to be ashamed of where he came from. I had built the Thompson Family Trust in 1987 when David was 12 and I was 38, newly divorced and terrified. The divorce had been brutal. David's father, Robert, had left us for his secretary, a cliché so painful I couldn't even laugh about it. He disappeared one Thursday morning, leaving only a note on the kitchen counter and emptied bank accounts. "Tell David I'll call," the note had said. He never did. Back then, I was working 3 jobs, cleaning office buildings at night, selling cosmetics door-to-door during the day, and doing bookkeeping for a small construction company on weekends. Every penny I could scrape together went into that trust. Every sacrifice, every skipped meal, every pair of shoes I wore until they had holes. I remember the exact moment I decided to create the trust. David had come home from school crying because his classmates were talking about college, and he said, "Mom, kids like us don't go to college, do we?" That night, after he went to bed, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills. I did the math over and over until my eyes burned. If I could save $200 a month, invest it carefully, work extra shifts, maybe, just maybe, I could give him the opportunities I'd never had. The first deposit was $127. I remember because it was everything left after rent and groceries. I drove to the bank with that check, hands shaking, feeling like I was building something sacred. 23 years later, that trust was worth $2.3 million. Not billionaire money, but enough to ensure David never had to work if he didn't want to. Enough to pay for his Harvard MBA, his penthouse apartment, his BMW, and apparently his $150,000 wedding to a woman whose family owned half of Connecticut. The dinner that destroyed everything had been in February, on a night that started with so much hope. David had called me that morning, sounding almost like his old self. "Mom, I was wondering if I could bring some friends over for dinner this Friday. I've been telling them about your famous pot roast." My heart had soared. It had been months since he'd wanted to spend time with me, even longer since he'd mentioned my cooking. "Of course, sweetheart, how many people?" "Just 4, and Mom," his voice had gotten careful, "just keep it simple, okay? These are important people." I should have heard the warning in his voice, but I was too happy to pay attention. I spent the entire week planning. I bought new cloth napkins, real ones, not paper. I polished my grandmother's silver candlesticks, the ones I'd saved from the pawn shop during the worst financial times. I even drove 40 minutes to the fancy grocery store for organic vegetables and prime beef. The day of the dinner, I cleaned my house until it sparkled. I arranged flowers from my garden in mason jars, thinking they looked rustic and charming. I wore my best dress, a navy blue one I'd bought on sale 3 years ago for David's graduation. The guests arrived at 7 sharp in a black Mercedes that cost more than I'd made in 2 years. 3 young men in expensive suits and a blonde woman who looked like she'd stepped off a magazine cover. They all had that unmistakable gleam of inherited wealth, perfect teeth, confident postures, the casual arrogance of people who'd never worried about money. David introduced them with names that sounded like law firms: Preston Worthington Roman III, Charles Blackstone Jr., James Montgomery Price, and Vivian St. Clair. When Preston shook my hand, his grip was limp and cold, and his eyes were already scanning my living room, cataloging everything he found lacking. "What a cozy home," Vivian had said, her smile sharp as a knife. I watched her take in my mismatched furniture, the family photos showing David and me in front of our old trailer, the Afghan my mother had crocheted draped over the back of my worn recliner. Dinner was a disaster from the first course. I'd made a beautiful salad with fresh greens and homemade vinaigrette, but Charles poked at it like it might contain poison. When I mentioned I'd grown the lettuce myself, James raised an eyebrow and muttered something about organic. The main course was worse. I'd spent hours preparing my famous pot roast, the same recipe David had loved since childhood. But when I served it on my everyday dishes, white ones with tiny blue flowers that I'd bought at a yard sale 15 years ago, I saw David close his eyes in what looked like physical pain. "This is rustic," Preston had said, cutting his meat with the precision of a surgeon. "Very authentic." Vivian examined her plate like she was studying bacteria under a microscope. "Is this how you always serve dinner?" she'd asked, her tone suggesting she was conducting some sort of anthropological study. "Yes," I'd said, confused. "Is something wrong?" "Oh no," she'd replied quickly, "it's just so different from what we're used to." Charles asked about the wine. I'd bought a bottle from the grocery store for $12, thinking I was being extravagant. "Interesting choice," he'd murmured, but his tone suggested it was anything but. The conversation grew more strained as the evening progressed. They talked about vacation homes in the Hamptons, charity galas I'd never heard of, mutual friends with hyphenated names. I tried to contribute, mentioning that I'd always wanted to see the ocean, but my comment was met with polite silence. When I mentioned that I cleaned office buildings for a living, the silence became deafening. Preston actually put down his fork. "Facilities management," David had said quickly. "My mother is in facilities management." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "I clean office buildings, nights mostly, it's honest work." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. James had cleared his throat. "That's admirable, very hands-on." After they left earlier than planned, with excuses about early morning meetings, David had exploded. But first, there was the moment right after they drove away. David stood in my living room, still in his expensive suit, looking around like he'd never seen the place before, and maybe, in a way, he hadn't. Maybe he'd spent so long looking at it through other people's eyes that he'd forgotten it was home. "Do you know what you just cost me?" he'd said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I don't understand." Preston's father, Jeremy Worthington, runs one of the most exclusive investment firms in the city. He was considering me for a position. 6 figures to start, Mom, the kind of opportunity people kill for. I still didn't understand. "But you have a good job." "I have a job," he'd exploded, his voice echoing off my walls. "What I need is a career. What I need is to be taken seriously by people who matter." "I thought dinner went well," I'd said weakly. "The roast was perfect and—" "The roast?" He'd laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mom, they were laughing at us, at the yard sale dishes, at your homemade salad dressing, at the fact that you told them you grow vegetables in your backyard like some sort of peasant." The word hit me like a slap. "David, there's nothing wrong with growing vegetables. You used to help me plant them when you were little. You said it was fun." I was a kid, I didn't know any better. His face was red now, veins standing out on his forehead. "Don't you understand? Image is everything in this world, everything. I've spent years building a reputation, creating a persona that these people respect, and you ruin it all just by existing." I tried to explain that I was proud to be his mother, that where we came from didn't matter, but he'd cut me off with a laugh so cold it made my blood freeze. Where we came from is exactly the problem. Do you think Preston Worthington's mother serves dinner on dishes from yard sales? Do you think Charles Blackstone's mother cleans toilets for a living? I clean offices, not. IT doesn't matter, he'd roared. Don't you see, you're a reminder of everything I'm trying to escape. Every time I look at you, I see that trailer park, I see those food stamps, I see all the ways we were different from everyone else. I'd started crying then, which only made him angrier. Oh, perfect, now you're crying, because that's exactly what successful people do when faced with adversity. They break down and cry. I worked so hard, I'd whispered. I gave you everything I had. You gave me your limitations, he'd shot back. You gave me your small-town mentality, your lack of ambition, your willingness to settle for scraps. That's when the knife went deepest. I've worked so hard to escape that life, and you keep dragging me back into it. Every time someone asks about my family, I have to figure out how to explain you away. Do you know how exhausting that is? I'd felt something break inside my chest. Explain me away. Yes, because I can't tell them the truth. I can't tell them my mother lives in a house that looks like a museum of poverty. I can't tell them she grows her own food because she's too cheap to buy it. I can't tell them she still has furniture from the 80s. I kept that furniture because it reminds me of when you were little, I'd said. The couch where you used to fall asleep watching movies, the table where you did your homework. Memories don't pay the bills, he'd screamed. Nostalgia doesn't open doors. Your sentimental attachment to secondhand furniture is destroying my future. That's when he'd said the words that shattered my heart. You're not family anymore, Mom. You're just the woman who signs the checks. You're a liability, a reminder of everything I'm trying to forget. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to keep funding my lifestyle through that trust, and you're going to stay out of my life. I tried to speak, but he wasn't finished. I don't want you at company events, I don't want you meeting my colleagues, and I sure as hell don't want you embarrassing me in front of people who could change my life. You want to keep living in the past? Fine, but don't drag me down with you. He'd grabbed his coat and headed for the door, then turned back one last time. Oh, and Mom, next time someone asks about my family, I'm going to tell them you're dead. It'll be easier for everyone that way. He'd left that night without another word, slamming my door so hard the pictures rattled and fell off the wall. I'd spent the rest of the night picking up broken glass and crying until I couldn't breathe. That was 8 months ago, 8 months of silence, 8 months of signing quarterly distribution checks and mailing them to his penthouse address like some sort of automated machine. 8 months of wondering where I'd gone wrong. But when I opened that wedding invitation addressed to my trust fund instead of me, something fundamental shifted. The invitation was beautiful, thick paper, elegant calligraphy, a tasteful monogram. It spoke of wealth and tradition and exclusivity. And nowhere on it was there any mention of a mother. The RSVP card was even more telling. It had options for bride's family, groom's family, and business associates. I apparently fell into the third category. I called my lawyer that afternoon. Richard Hemingway had been handling my legal affairs for 15 years. He'd helped me set up the trust, navigate my divorce, even contest a parking ticket once when I was too intimidated to go to court myself. He was a quiet man in his 60s who wore the same brown suit to every meeting and never charged me more than I could afford. Margaret, he said when I called, what can I do for you? Richard, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I need to freeze the Thompson family trust. There was a pause. Margaret, that's a significant decision. Can you tell me why? I told him about the invitation, about the words David had said, about how I'd raised him alone after his father left, how I'd worked myself to the bone to give him opportunities I'd never had. He said, I'm not family anymore, I finished quietly, so I think it's time he learned what family actually means. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you doing this out of hurt feelings, or do you genuinely believe it's the right thing to do? I'd been asking myself the same question for months. Richard, I created that trust to take care of my family. If David doesn't consider himself part of this family, if he's built his life on pretending I don't exist, then how can he benefit from my family's money? That's a fair point, Richard said slowly. And legally, you have broad discretionary power as trustee, but Margaret, once we do this, there's no taking it back quietly. This will force a confrontation. I'm ready for a confrontation. I've been avoiding one for 8 months and it's only gotten worse. All right then, I'll draw up the papers. But before Richard could file the paperwork, I needed to do some investigating. If David had been lying about me to his friends, what else had he been lying about? I started with social media. David's Instagram was a carefully curated showcase of his new life, photos of expensive restaurants, charity galas, vacation trips to places I'd only seen in magazines. But what struck me most was what wasn't there. No photos of me, no mention of his childhood. No acknowledgement that he'd ever had a family. His LinkedIn profile was even more revealing. According to the professional summary, David Thompson had overcome significant early challenges to achieve success in finance. The education section listed Phillips Exeter Academy as his prep school, a lie. We couldn't afford private school. He'd attended the local public high school on scholarships I'd helped him apply for. But the most shocking discovery came when I Googled his name along with family and background. I found an interview he'd given to Harvard Business Review about successful young executives. In it, he described being raised by a wealthy aunt after losing his parents in a tragic accident at age 12. My hands shook as I read the article. According to David, his fictional parents had died in a car crash, leaving him to be raised by his father's sister, a woman who supposedly ran a successful art gallery in Boston. He described the trauma of loss and how it had motivated him to excel academically and professionally. There was more. I found a video of him speaking at a Young Professionals Network event, telling the same story to a rapt audience. He spoke eloquently about overcoming grief and honoring his parents' memory through success. I watched my son lie about my existence for 12 minutes straight, and I felt something inside me die. But then I found something that made my blood boil. Sophia's Family Foundation, the Aldridge Foundation for Parentless Youth, had a board of directors page on their website. David's photo was there, along with his bio. David Thompson brings a unique perspective to our mission, having experienced the loss of both parents at a young age. His personal journey from tragedy to triumph embodies the resilience we hope to foster in the youth we serve. They were paying him $50,000 a year to speak about family trauma while his very much alive mother cleaned office buildings to fund his lifestyle. I called Richard back. I found something, I said, and told him everything I'd discovered. Richard was quiet for a long time. Margaret, this is worse than I thought. What David is doing could be considered fraud. He's receiving compensation under false pretenses. Can we use this? We can use it to justify the trust freeze, absolutely. This isn't just about hurt feelings anymore. This is about him profiting from lies that explicitly deny your existence. Then do it, file the papers. The legal documents were served to David on a Thursday. I know because Richard called to confirm delivery and because my doorbell rang at 7:30 that night. When I opened the door, my son was standing there with papers in his hand and rage in his eyes. But this time, I was ready for him. What the hell is this? He demanded, pushing past me into my living room. I looked at the documents. Temporary suspension of trust distributions pending beneficiary review was printed across the top in bold letters. It's exactly what it says, I replied calmly. The trust has been frozen until further notice. His face went white, then red, then white again. You can't do this, that money is mine. Actually, I said, settling into my worn recliner, the same one he'd insulted months earlier, that money belongs to the trust, and I'm the trustee, which means I decide when and how it gets distributed. But the wedding is in 6 weeks. I've already put deposits down, the venue, the caterer, the band, everything's been paid for with the assumption that my quarterly distribution would cover it. I nodded sympathetically. That does sound like a problem. A problem? His voice cracked. Mom, please, you don't understand. Sophia's family expects a certain level of presentation if I can't deliver. Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you decided I wasn't family anymore. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. You can't be serious. I'm very serious, David. You made it clear that you want my money but not me. Well, I'm afraid it doesn't work that way. The trust was established to benefit my family, and according to you, I don't have any family. That's when he started yelling again, about how I was vindictive, how I was trying to ruin his life, how I didn't understand the pressures he was under. But this time I had ammunition. David, I said quietly, interrupting his tirade, would you like to explain to me about your parents' tragic death? The color drained from his face. What? The car accident when you were 12, the wealthy aunt who raised you. I found the interview. He went completely still. I also found the video of your speech to the Young Professionals Network, very moving, very detailed. You almost had me convinced that I was dead. Mom, I can explain. Can you? Can you explain how you've been accepting payment from Sophia's Family Foundation for sharing your experience as an orphan? Can you explain how you've built your entire professional identity on a tragedy that never happened? He slumped into my old couch, the one he'd criticized for being outdated, and put his head in his hands. It started small, he said quietly, just little lies to fit in, then the lies got bigger and I couldn't take them back. You've been profiting from my supposed death, David, while I sign your checks every quarter. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. I know how it sounds. How it sounds? David, you've been living off my money while telling the world I'm dead. Do you understand how sick that is? I never meant for it to go this far. But it did go this far, and now you have to face the consequences. That's when he really started yelling, about how I was trying to destroy him, about how I didn't understand his world, about how everything he'd worked for would be ruined. Good, I finally shouted back, surprising us both. Let it be ruined, let them see who you really are. He stared at me in shock. I'd never raised my voice to him like that before. You want to know the truth, David? I'm embarrassed too. I'm embarrassed that I raised a son who's ashamed of the woman who gave him everything. I'm embarrassed that you think so little of my love that you'd rather pretend I'm dead than introduce me to your friends. It's not about love. It's all about love, I screamed. It's about the fact that you think my love isn't good enough for your new life, that the woman who worked 3 jobs to put you through school isn't worthy of your fancy friends. We were both crying now. I cleaned toilets for you, I said, my voice breaking. I ate ramen noodles for dinner so you could have fresh fruit in your lunch. I wore the same coat for 8 winters so you could have new school clothes. And this is how you repay me, by killing me off for your convenience. David was sobbing now. Mom, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this, David. Sorry doesn't erase the fact that you chose to build your life on my grave. I walked to the door and opened it. Get out, I said quietly. Mom, please. Get out. He left, but not before turning back one more time. I'll fight this, he said. I'll get a lawyer. Go ahead, I replied. But remember, David, I have all the evidence of your lies, every interview, every video, every fraudulent claim. Are you sure you want this to go public? His face went white and he left without another word. I didn't hear from him for 2 weeks, but I heard about him. Richard called with updates. David had retained Sandra Kellerman, a high-powered attorney from downtown who specialized in trust disputes. She was expensive, the kind of lawyer who charged $800 an hour and had never lost a case. Can they win? I asked. They can try, Richard said, but the trust documents are airtight and now we have evidence of fraud. That changes everything. But Richard called back the next day with more disturbing news. Margaret, Sandra Kellerman has filed a motion claiming you're suffering from dementia and are no longer competent to manage the trust. My blood ran cold. What? They're arguing that your decision to freeze the trust is evidence of mental incompetence. They want the court to appoint David as trustee. I felt sick. Can they do that? They can try, but we'll fight it. We'll need to get you examined by a psychiatrist, prove that you're mentally competent. This is insane. Margaret, there's something else. They're also claiming that you've been financially abusing David by withholding distributions. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Financial abuse with his own money. That's their argument. They're painting you as a controlling mother who's using money to manipulate her adult son. The next few weeks were a nightmare. I had to undergo psychological evaluations, cognitive tests, interviews with social workers. It was humiliating and exhausting, but I passed every test with flying colors. Meanwhile, David's lies were starting to unravel in other ways. The Harvard Business Review received an anonymous tip about his false background claims. They issued a correction and removed the interview from their website. The Young Professionals Network canceled his upcoming speaking engagement. Worse yet, someone had forwarded the information to the Aldrich Foundation. I found out about that when Sophia's father called me directly. Mrs. Thompson, the voice was crisp, authoritative. This is William Aldridge. I believe you're David's mother. My heart pounded. Yes, sir. I think we need to talk. We met at an upscale coffee shop downtown. William Aldridge was exactly what I'd expected, tall, distinguished, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car, but his eyes were kind and he stood when I approached. Mrs. Thompson, thank you for meeting with me. I have to say I'm quite confused. About what, Mr. Aldridge? About why my daughter's fiancé has been telling people his mother is dead when you're clearly very much alive. I told him everything. The dinner, the fight, the lies, the trust freeze. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. Mrs. Thompson, he said when I finished, I owe you an apology. Our foundation has been paying David to speak about overcoming the loss of his parents. If I'd known. You couldn't have known. But I should have done better research. We pride ourselves on authenticity. He paused. There's something else. David has asked me for a loan to cover his wedding expenses. He said his trust fund was tied up in legal matters. He did. $50,000. He said it was temporary, that he'd pay it back after the wedding. William's expression was grim. Now I understand why he needs the money. I felt terrible for this man, for his daughter, for everyone David had dragged into his web of lies. Mr. Aldridge, I need you to know that David isn't a bad person. He's lost and he's made terrible choices, but… Mrs. Thompson, he interrupted gently, with all due respect, a man who denies his mother's existence to profit from her supposed death, that's not just being lost, that's being fundamentally dishonest about who he is. He was right, and we both knew it. What will you do? I asked. I'll be speaking with Sophia tonight. She deserves to know the truth about the man she's planning to marry. That night my phone rang at 11 p.m. It was David, and he was hysterical. She broke up with me, he screamed. Sophia called off the wedding. Are you happy now? David, I didn't. You ruined everything, my career, my relationship, my entire future. I hope you're satisfied. I never wanted this to happen. Yes, you did. You wanted to punish me and you succeeded. But you know what? You've destroyed yourself too, because now everyone knows what kind of person you really are. What kind of person am I, David? A vindictive old woman who can't let go, a mother who would rather destroy her son than admit she doesn't fit into his world. The words hit like physical blows, but I forced myself to stay calm. David, I'm going to hang up now. When you're ready to have an adult conversation, call me back. Don't you dare hang up on me. I hung up. The court hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on Friday, October 15th, exactly 1 week before David's canceled wedding date. I arrived early, wearing my best dress and carrying a folder of documents Richard had prepared. The courthouse was intimidating: marble floors, high ceilings, the kind of formal setting that made me feel small and out of place. But I reminded myself why I was there. I was fighting for something bigger than money. I was fighting for the principle that family means something. David arrived with Sandra Kellerman, who looked exactly like I'd expected: perfectly groomed, expensively dressed, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from winning most of your battles. When she saw me, her smile was sharp as a blade. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, extending a manicured hand, "I'm Sandra Kellerman. I represent your son." "I know who you are," I replied, not taking her hand. David looked terrible, pale, thin, with dark circles under his eyes. When our eyes met, I saw something I hadn't expected: shame. The hearing began with Sandra painting me as an unstable elderly woman using money as a weapon. She argued that my decision to freeze the trust was evidence of mental incompetence, that I was emotionally manipulating my son because my feelings were hurt. "Your Honor," she said, pacing in front of the judge's bench, "Mrs. Thompson's actions are those of a woman who cannot accept that her adult son has outgrown her. Rather than seeking healthy boundaries, she has weaponized the trust to control and punish Mr. Thompson." She painted David as a victim, a successful young man being held hostage by his mother's emotional instability. "Mr. Thompson has built a distinguished career in finance. He's engaged to be married to a wonderful woman from a respected family. But rather than celebrating her son's success, Mrs. Thompson has chosen to sabotage it out of jealousy and spite." It was a compelling narrative, and I could see Judge Henley nodded slowly. "Mr. Thompson, do you have anything to say?" David wiped his eyes and stood up. His lawyer tried to stop him, but he shook his head. "Your Honor, my mother is right about all of it. I've been living a lie for so long I almost started believing it myself. But the truth is, everything I am is because of her. She didn't just fund my education, she taught me how to work hard, how to persevere, how to dream bigger than my circumstances." He turned to face me fully. "Mom, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I've hurt you in ways that maybe can't be fixed. But I need you to know that not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about you. I just didn't know how to come back from the lies I'd told." He paused, struggling with his words. "I told Sophia's family you were dead because I was a coward. I told my colleagues I was an orphan because I thought it would make me more interesting, more sympathetic. I told myself I was protecting you from my world, but really I was protecting myself from having to explain why my mother cleans offices while I live in a penthouse." His voice grew stronger. "But here's what I should have told them. I should have told them that my mother is the strongest person I know, that she raised me alone and never once made me feel like I was missing anything, that she taught me love isn't about what you can buy, it's about what you're willing to sacrifice." He was crying openly now, but his voice didn't waver. "I should have told them she worked her fingers to the bone so I could have opportunities she never had, that she never missed a parent-teacher conference even when it meant losing pay, that she sat up with me all night when I had pneumonia, sleeping in a chair by my bed. That she believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." He looked directly at Judge Henley. "Your Honor, I don't deserve the trust fund. I haven't honored the family it was meant to support. I've dishonored it. I've dishonored her, and if she never forgives me, I'll understand. But I want the record to show that Margaret Thompson is the best mother a son could ask for, and I've been the worst son imaginable." Judge Henley was quiet for a long moment, reviewing her papers. "This is an unusual case," she said finally. "Mr. Thompson, you've admitted to years of fraudulent misrepresentation. You've profited from false claims that explicitly deny your mother's existence and sacrifice. In some jurisdictions, what you've done could be considered criminal fraud." David nodded miserably. "Mrs. Thompson, you've demonstrated that the freeze was not vindictive but a reasonable response to your son's rejection of the family relationship the trust was designed to support." She paused, studying both of us. However, I'm also seeing a young man who clearly loves his mother despite his terrible choices, and a mother who, despite being deeply hurt, still cares about her son's well-being." Judge Henley leaned forward. "Here's my ruling. The trust freeze will remain in place for 6 months. During that time, Mr. Thompson will attend family counseling with his mother. He will also make public corrections to his fraudulent claims and return any compensation received under false pretenses to the appropriate organizations." David's face went white, but he nodded. "Furthermore, Mr. Thompson will perform 200 hours of community service, specifically working with programs that support single mothers and their children. You need to understand what your mother's life was actually like." She turned to me. "Mrs. Thompson, if meaningful reconciliation occurs during this period, the trust will be unfrozen. However, future distributions will be contingent on Mr. Thompson maintaining an honest and respectful relationship with you. This court will retain jurisdiction to ensure compliance." Judge Henley's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Thompson, your actions have been potentially criminal. The only reason I'm not referring this to the district attorney is because I believe you have a genuine chance to make this right. Don't waste it." As court adjourned, David approached me hesitantly. "Mom, would you be willing to try the counseling?" I looked at him, really looked at him. He was 38, but in that moment he looked like the scared 12-year-old I'd held when his father left us. "Yes," I said quietly, "I'll try." He started crying again. "I'm so sorry, Mom, for everything." I wasn't ready to hug him yet. Too much had been broken, too much trust destroyed. "We have a lot of work to do, David." "I know, I'll do whatever it takes. I swear to you, I'll do whatever it takes." "What about Sophia, the wedding?" His face crumpled. "There isn't going to be a wedding." When her father told her the truth about everything, she couldn't handle it. She said she couldn't marry someone who'd built their entire relationship on lies. I felt unexpected sympathy. "I'm sorry." "Don't be, she was right. If she couldn't love me knowing where I really came from, then she didn't really love me at all. She loved the person I was pretending to be." That was the first thing he'd said in years that sounded like the David I'd raised. But the real work was just beginning. The next 6 months were the hardest of my life. We met with Dr. Sarah Chen every Tuesday at 2 p.m. She was a family therapist in her 50s who didn't pull punches and had no patience for excuses. "Margaret," she said during our first session, "you have to decide if you want to punish David or heal this relationship. You can't do both effectively. I don't want to punish him, I just want him to understand what he did to me. And David, you have to sit with the full weight of your choices. You didn't just lie about your mother, you erased her existence and profited from her supposed death. Do you understand how devastating that is?" David nodded, tears already starting. "I'm beginning to." The sessions were brutal. Week after week, we dug into years of hurt and shame. David had to confront his feelings about our background, his internalized classism, his deep-seated fear of being found out. I had to confront my own feelings of inadequacy and my role in enabling his shame. "When David told you that you didn't fit into his world, what did you hear?" Dr. Chen asked during our third session. "That I wasn't good enough, that all my sacrifices meant nothing, that the life I'd built for us was something to be ashamed of." "And David, when you looked at your mother in that world of wealth and privilege, what did you see?" "Everything I was trying to escape from," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Poverty, struggle, being different. I saw her and remembered what it felt like to be the kid with second-hand clothes and free lunch, and I hated those feelings so much that I transferred that hatred to her." "But she wasn't the source of your struggles, was she?" "No," he was crying now. "She was the solution to them. She made sure I never went hungry, even when she did. She made sure I had opportunities, even when she had to sacrifice her own dreams." "So why did you blame her?" David was quiet for a long time. "Because it was easier than dealing with my own shame. It was easier to pretend she didn't exist than to figure out how to integrate my past with my present." Dr. Chen turned to me. "Margaret, how did it feel when David told you he was ashamed of you?" Like dying, I said simply. Like everything I'd worked for, everything I'd given up was worthless. And what did you want from him in that moment? I wanted him to see me, really see me, not as an embarrassment or a liability, but as a person who loved him enough to give him everything I had. The breakthrough came in our 8th session. David had been talking about his community service work. He was volunteering at a shelter for single mothers and their children. "There's this woman there, Maria," he said. "She's working 2 jobs to support her 3 kids. She reminds me so much of you, Mom, from when I was little." He paused, collecting his thoughts. Yesterday, her 8-year-old son was doing homework at the kitchen table while she made dinner. And he looked up at her and said, "Mama, when I'm rich, I'm going to buy you a big house so you don't have to work so hard." David's voice cracked. And Maria smiled at him with so much love, and she said, "Joe, I don't need a big house. I just need you to remember that everything I do is because I love you." He looked at me with fresh tears. "That's what you were trying to tell me, wasn't it, all those years? That the sacrifices didn't matter because you loved me, but I was so focused on escaping our circumstances that I never saw the love behind them." I nodded, unable to speak. I watched that little boy's face light up when his mother said that, and I realized, that's how I used to look at you before I learned to be ashamed, before I decided that love wasn't enough. That was the day we both started to heal. David began making the public corrections the court had ordered. He issued statements to every organization he'd misled, returned the money from speaking engagements, resigned from positions he'd obtained under false pretenses. It was humiliating and expensive, but he did it without complaint. The Harvard Business Review published a full retraction and apology. The Young Professionals Network issued a statement about the importance of authenticity in their speakers. The Aldrich Foundation not only removed David from their board but also implemented new verification procedures for their speakers. More importantly, David started telling people the truth about me. At first, it was awkward. He'd stumble over words when explaining that his mother was actually alive and had raised him alone. But gradually, it became easier. "I want you to meet my mom," he said to a colleague one day when I visited his office. "She's the reason I'm here. Everything I've accomplished is because of her sacrifices." The man looked confused. He'd clearly heard the orphan story, but David explained simply and honestly. "I made some mistakes about my family history. I let shame cloud my judgment, but my mother is very much alive and I'm incredibly grateful for everything she's done for me." There were consequences, of course. Some doors that had been open to him closed. Some people who had admired his tragic backstory lost interest when they learned the truth. But David handled it all with a grace I hadn't seen from him in years. "I deserve this," he told me one evening over dinner. "I built my reputation on lies, now I have to build a new one on truth." The trust was unfrozen after 6 months, but David asked for new conditions to be added. He wanted a portion of his distributions to go to a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. He moved out of his expensive penthouse and bought a modest house just 10 minutes from mine. And every Sunday, he comes over for dinner. Not because he has to, the court mandate ended months ago, but because he wants to, because somewhere in those painful therapy sessions we found our way back to each other. Last week, he brought me flowers, not expensive ones, but daisies from the grocery store, the kind I used to pick for him when we lived in the trailer park. "Thank you," he said, putting them in a mason jar, the same kind I'd used for our dinner party that night, the one that had started this whole nightmare. "For what?" "For not giving up on me, for loving me enough to let me fall, for teaching me that family isn't about money or status or what other people think. It's about showing up, it's about choosing each other over and over again, even when it's hard." I smiled and handed him a plate, one of the yard sale dishes he'd once been so ashamed of. "Especially when it's hard," I corrected gently. We ate in comfortable silence, and I thought about how sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to find their way back home. How sometimes love means holding your ground when everything in you wants to give in. The trust documents now specify that future distributions are contingent on weekly family dinners. David suggested that clause himself. "I never want to forget again," he told Richard when we updated the paperwork. "I never want to take for granted the woman who gave me everything." "But what if you get married again?" Richard had asked. "What if your wife doesn't want weekly dinners with your mother?" David had smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. "Then she's not the right woman for me. Anyone who wants to be part of my life has to understand that my mother is part of my life, non-negotiable." Some people might say I was too harsh, that freezing the trust was cruel, that public humiliation was excessive punishment for a son who'd lost his way. But I know David. He needed to lose everything to remember what actually mattered. He needed to face the consequences of his choices to understand that actions have prices. And me, I needed to remember that I was worth fighting for, that my love wasn't just a bank account to be accessed when convenient, that being family means choosing to honor each other, especially when the world tells you that where you come from doesn't matter. The truth is, where you come from matters enormously, not because it defines your limits but because it shapes your character. David forgot that for a while. He thought he could edit out the parts of his story that didn't fit his desired image. But you can't build a life on lies without destroying something essential in yourself. David learned that the hard way. The trust is bigger now than it's ever been, and not just financially. It's backed by something stronger than money, the knowledge that we fought for each other and won, that we chose love over pride, family over status, and each other over everything else that seemed important at the time. Every Sunday when David walks through my door with his easy smile and grocery store flowers, I'm reminded that sometimes the best investments take time to mature. Sometimes you have to freeze the account to remember what's actually valuable. The mason jar sits on my windowsill now, filled with fresh daisies every week, not because they're expensive, but because they're chosen with love, because they remember where we came from and who we are when everything else is stripped away. Family, real family, the kind that can't be bought or sold or frozen in a trust account, the kind that endures through fights and forgiveness, through pride and humility, through loss and the long journey back home. That's the only inheritance that really matters, and it's the one thing no lawyer can ever freeze. But perhaps most importantly, it's the one thing that no amount of shame or ambition or fear can destroy, if you're brave enough to fight for it when it matters most. David learned that lesson the hard way, but he learned it. And now, every Sunday we practice it together over dinner, using dishes from yard sales and love that's worth more than any trust fund ever could be. Henley taking notes. Then Richard stood up. "Your Honor, this case is about family. It's about what happens when someone tries to erase their family history for personal gain." He opened his folder and pulled out a photo of David and me from his high school graduation. This is David Thompson at 18 with his mother Margaret, after delivering a valedictorian speech crediting her sacrifices with his success. This is the same David Thompson who now claims his mother died when he was 12. A murmur went through the courtroom. Over the next hour, Richard methodically laid out David's deception, the false prep school claims, the fake orphan story, the money he'd made speaking about family tragedy while his real family member sat alone, wondering where she'd gone wrong. But the most damning evidence came next. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence this application to serve on the board of the Aldridge Foundation for Parentless Youth." Richard handed the document to Judge Henley, who read it with increasing astonishment. In this application, Mr. Thompson describes the devastating loneliness of growing up without family love. He details the supposed car accident that killed his parents and the wealthy aunt who raised him. He speaks eloquently about the trauma of loss and how it shaped his worldview. Richard paused for effect. Meanwhile, the woman who actually raised him, who worked 3 jobs to put him through school, who sacrificed everything for his success, was being told she was no longer family. She was being erased so completely that he could profit from pretending she never existed. Judge Henley looked directly at David. Mr. Thompson, is it true that you've been representing yourself as an orphan? David's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but he ignored her. Yes, he said quietly. And you've received compensation for speaking about losing your parents while your mother was very much alive. Yes. And did you tell your mother she was no longer family? David's voice was barely a whisper. Yes. Judge Henley studied him for a long moment. Help me understand something, Mr. Thompson. You've made money telling people about overcoming family trauma, but your real mother, the woman who actually raised you, wasn't even invited to your wedding. She learned about it from an invitation addressed to her trust fund. How do you reconcile this? David looked at me for the first time since the hearing began. I saw tears forming in his eyes. I don't know, he said. I got lost. I wanted to fit in so badly with Sophia's world that every time I looked at my mom, I was reminded of everything I was trying to escape. What were you trying to escape from? Being poor, being nobody, having a mother who cleaned offices while other people's mothers played tennis. His voice cracked. I was ashamed, and instead of dealing with that shame, I just erased her. The courtroom was completely silent. But she's not dead, Mr. Thompson. She's sitting right there. David looked at me again, and this time the tears spilled over. I know, he whispered, and I've been dying inside about it for years. Judge Henley turned to me. Mrs. Thompson, what is it you want from this situation? I stood up slowly, my knees shaking. Your Honor, I don't want his money back. I never did. I built that trust to secure his future because I believed that's what mothers do. We sacrifice for our children's dreams. I looked at David, who was openly crying now. I worked 3 jobs for 15 years to build that trust. I ate ramen noodles so he could have fresh fruit in his lunch. I wore the same coat for 8 winters so he could have new school clothes. I did all of that gladly because he was my son and I loved him. My voice was getting stronger. But what I can't accept is being erased, being turned into a convenient fiction so he can profit from a tragedy that never happened. I won't fund his lifestyle while he tells the world I'm dead. I paused, gathering my courage. Your Honor, I established that trust to provide for my family. If David doesn't consider himself part of this family, if he's built his entire adult life on denying my existence, then I don't see how he can in good conscience benefit from my family's money.